My name is Alison Ribeiro de Menezes. I'm Professor of Hispanic Studies at the University of Warwick, and I am really delighted and proud to be helping this evening to chair this discussion on the launch of the book, Believing the Image, Political Torture on Film by Berenike Jung, a PhD graduate of the University of Warwick. I was lucky to be one of the examiners of this thesis quite a long time back. And I'm absolutely delighted that she invited me to be involved today. As many of you will know, Berenike teaches film studies at the University of Groningen, which I hope I've pronounced correctly, not being a Germanist. Worked previously at King's College London and the Institute of Media Studies in Tübingen. And as I said, took her PhD in film and television studies from Warwick in 2016. We're here today to celebrate this wonderful book, The Invisibilities of Torture, the Presence of Absence in US and Chilean Cinema. And I'm just going to take the opportunity as well to note that Berenike has other work coming out that shows you the wide-ranging and interdisciplinary nature of her research. So she has a piece on the ethics of seeing in the film Get Out, and she has an article also on decolonization in film studies coming out with Film Education. And interestingly is working on TikTok. So there is a very wide range to her work. But of course, it's the book that we're mostly going to talk about today. Today's session is going to consist of a series of presentations, first by Berenike herself, then by Victor Fan, who joins us. He is a reader in film and media philosophy at King's College London, and the author of Cinema Approaching Reality, Locating Chinese Film Theory, also Extraterritoriality, Locating Hong Kong Cinema and Media, and has a forthcoming book, Cinema Illuminating Reality, Media Philosophy Through Buddhism. So again, a very strong film studies perspective there, but also a focus on the question of the nature of the image, which is part very much of Berenike's book, of course. And lastly, we hope to be joined by Vania Barraza, Professor of Spanish at the University of Memphis, although as is usual now with the technology that we've got so used to using in the last 2 years, there may be a slight hiccup there, but hopefully Vania, who works on Latin American literature and culture with a particular emphasis on Chile, will indeed be able to join us today. I'd like to note that we are recording this session, so please take note. And also to say that at the end of our discussion, we will open for questions, which, given the number of people in the meeting, I'm going to suggest you might put into the chat. There may be overlaps, and I'll try and collate those and make sure that they get put to our speakers. But so that everyone has a chance, perhaps, to put their point, we'll use the chat for that, if you would, please. But for now, it's a great pleasure to hand over to Berenike to talk about this wonderful book.
Thank you, Alison. That was for that wonderful introduction. I'm gonna share my screen now.
Okay. I'll just say while you're doing that, I've got a note to say Vania has joined us. So
wonderful!
Great to see you, Vania. I'm sorry I didn't see that before.
That is great news. Yes, okay. Thank you so much, Alison, for that introduction. Thank you, everybody, for joining, for being here, and especially, obviously, to Victor and Vania and Alison for being with me here on this panel. And I'd like to particularly thank the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and the Center for the Study of Cultural Memory for supporting this event, for providing the infrastructure and really helping me set this up. So that was great. What I'd like to do in my short presentation is to present a little bit of the genesis and some of the research questions that I raise in the book and how the book was created, which, as Alison has already said, is called The Invisibilities of Political Torture, the Presence of Absence in Chilean and US Cinema. And I'd like to go over three key aspects that I that are necessary to understand how I created this book. So the first one is the image of torture itself. What are the problems that that are created by having such an image? So that already raises these ideas of the spectacle and its relation to cinema. It's typically a very abject event that we might not want to look at. What kind of questions are generated by such an image, etc. Then the second part would be why torture now? So I would explain here, but I will explain a little bit my case studies and why I think these are still salient questions today, especially. And thirdly, cinema, what can be the political role of film here? What can films do and provide? What kind of knowledge and understanding? So firstly, the image of torture. The genesis of this project has a personal component. So I was working on violence in the movies, and then I was personally very shocked and affected by the images from the prisoner abuse in Abu Ghraib that went viral in 2004. And then unrelated to this event, I was living in Chile for some time in 2009, 2010, and learned about the large scale of torture that happened there under the Pinochet dictatorship. And I was shocked also by the relative absence of visual photographic evidence in that case. So my initial question, or how I set out this project, was to ask, how do films speak to such specific events in that situation, where you have either the presence of these very overdetermined images or the lack of such an iconography. So what I increasingly looked at under the rubric of the presence or absence of visual evidence. However, it became clear very quickly that this was more than, that is too quick, that this was more than a dichotomy between the visible in the US and the invisible in Chile. Because for once, there is plenty of there are plenty of important iconic images in Chile, as well as we can see here some of the book burning on the top left, then the prisoners captured in the Estado Nacional in Santiago, and protest against the torture movement, against the torture and the disappearance of people. So that is already, that sort of complicates a too simplistic binary between visibility and invisibility, because some images that are very hyper visible might in fact take up all the air and exclude other images or non-photographed truth. And so that already pointed me, or like that led me to complicate this research question a bit more towards this idea of what are actually perhaps the limitations of the visual here as an epistemological strategy, when you have both, these complicated situations. And I will speak a bit more on that later. But so when I started the research, I began also by looking into the tropes and discourse on torture itself. So in public discourse and in political rhetoric and in much Western cinema as well, torture is typically defined as a very isolated event, an exceptional event. It's typically paired as a response to terrorism, or as a kind of preemptive measure against terrorism. So it is typically framed as being provoked, very contained, and eventually productive. And all of this is part of in Elaine Scarry's words, the political fiction of torture. The fact is that torture takes place in countries regardless of their political ideologies. But on the other hand, at the same time, torture is not necessarily a part of every war, every conflict. It's not like an automatic or natural occurrence, which is also sometimes raised as a point. And so one of the key misrepresentations, perhaps the key misrepresentation on torture, is that we have this very strong investment in the idea that torture is in fact about information gathering, what Elaine Scarry calls the question. And this is something that is put forth in political discourse, and it's also fortified in cultural products, that we pretend that we are after the truth, Today, the truth is perhaps recast as intelligence gathering, information gathering, when in fact it has been shown over and over again that torture is in fact not at all productive or effective for that purpose. And so scholars like Elaine Scarry, Jennifer Balangi, or Paige Du Bois argue from various other scholarly perspectives, historical perspectives, cultural perspectives, that torture is in fact productive, but in other ways. What it does is it targets audiences beyond the immediate victims. It affects a social body, a collective body. So torture is about control, about spreading fear, about imposing a narrative on the social imagination and producing certain bodies that are then framed as torturable. And I spent some time on this because I believe that it is necessary to unravel these misrepresentations, because when we continue to misapprehend the nature of torture, we also misapprehend our incentive to resort to it. And that creates the conditions that enable the continuation or the repetition of torture. So why the US and Chile? There are specific historical entanglements of the US in Chile and in other Latin American countries that include funding of torture, exporting torture techniques to Latin America. And also, although there are differences, obviously massive differences between these cases, and without ignoring or minimizing these differences, there are also some disturbing continuities and similarities. So in both countries, the administrations that followed those under whose authority torture was conducted initially called to turn the page, to move on, to look forward and not backwards, etc., which resulted in a de facto amnesty. There were attempts in both countries to investigate the situation. So in Chile, there were several Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. There was somewhat of a delay in focusing on commissions specifically on torture. And while I cannot go into the details of all these TRCs, I'd like to point out that in spite of the shortcomings and limitations of their TRCs, the existence of them and of the reports that they published were really important also for TRCs in other countries, and it helped to dismantle certain revisionist narratives about what had happened. And in the US, there were also various investigations, and they culminated in this released executive summary of the so-called torture report, which has since been recalled. And so we go through the administrations, and the latest information is still that there are national security concerns typically cited whenever people push to have more information. So what we can see is there is a continued lack of accountability, and especially also on a transnational level. So there were many countries that participated in the war on terror, and we can, legitimately claim that there's a continuation of torture sponsorship by various democracies, and that partly answers the questions: why now? Why talk about these things now? Because as long as there is this deficit in terms of accountability, as long as we live in the state of at least relative impunity, in some ways, the torture that targets the social imagination has never really ended. So it's still an ongoing process. So what can films do then? Scholarship on violence in cinema has typically looked at torture not in itself, but framed in this response to terrorism that is so problematic because it buys into this political fiction. And that scholarship also tended to focus mostly on representational aspects, historical veracity, or on the potential for identification and the resulting emotional or ideological effects on audiences. And so what I did in the book was I tried to move away from this representation-focused analysis and move increasingly towards epistemological and ontological questions. What do I mean by this? So firstly, I looked at a range of relatively contemporary material, both photographs, nonfiction films, fiction films, television series, etc. And this relatively recent material must be considered in the context of film studies quote-unquote ontological crisis that was instigated by the digital turn. So to summarize this crisis, there is no longer, or it's more difficult. We cannot really establish this reliable, direct relationship between the cinematographic image and reality. This indexical link seems to be broken. And this sort of crisis of the truth value of the image meets the need for evidence in this topic of political torture, where there is such a desire to have this historical truth. So what I did in the book was to reframe the ethical question and move a bit away from this idea of the correct representation that then would also result in the correct reaction on the part of the viewer, etc., and more towards the conditions of our belief in the truth value of an image. And actually, there are some films that are looked at, for instance, Standard Operating Procedure, that explore this explicitly, that explicitly look at what is the status and the use of visual evidence. How do we relate to our current reality through images, etc. And so with regards to the epistemological framing, I built on the affective turn in memory and film scholarship and used affect as a critical mode to argue that actually some audiovisual texts are very successful in making emotional consequences, collective long-term consequences of the torture experientially available to the viewer. And in fact, one of the films that was made available to the audience, Carne de Perro by Fernando Guzzoni, is a very good example of this approach. So my overall argument is that films can potentially broaden our understanding of the nature of torture and thereby reframe the definition of torture. And they can do that, for instance, by inviting us to perceive these aspects that are typically neglected in the public and political discourse on torture, such as the emotional aftermath, the collective impact, etc. And this also means that audiovisual media can help expand this understanding of torture beyond a strictly visual sense. So beyond this, the image of the literal pulling of the fingernails and all the problems of spectacle and ethical viewing, etc., that this entails. And they can instead use the visual frame alongside other cinematic means to expand our understanding, and then hopefully eventually also the definition of torture to include such seemingly invisible repercussions. So to end, I'd like to say just a couple of things on the films that were made available. The first one, the Dog Flesh film, is, I think, a great example because we remain throughout the film really visually glued to this protagonist. We only find out indirectly that he's a former torturer, and yet, despite this, this seemingly very close visuality, the visual actually tells us very little about him and his interior, and we cannot really identify with him in the conventional sense of identification or the older sense of identification. And yet, through sound and other sensual modalities, the film is really very successful at rendering perceivable this toxic impact of torture. The other film that was made available to you is the probably more widely known No by Pablo Larraín. I looked at this film both in the context of Larraín's dictatorship trilogy. So all of these films question the powers of the visual in different ways. And I explored the film also in the context of scholarly discourses on cinematic realism, especially in quote-unquote world cinema. And in No, in particular, the film employs people, spaces, objects, and also the material body of the film itself in order to anchor itself to the real, and at the same time question the capacity of film to such anchoring, for such anchoring. And these formal explorations are also contextualized within the specific cultural implications of video at that time in Chile, and here built on the work by Germán Leñero. So by giving attention to the affective connotations that the materiality generates for different audiences, that opens wider question on transnational film production and reception. And here, again, I build on scholarship on hybrid practices and influences in Latin American film, such as Juan Poblete, Carolina Urrutia, Miriam Hado, and Joanna Page, among many others. Okay, and finally, I give, these are the chapters of the book. Obviously, there are many other aspects that I discussed there that I couldn't really outline here in this short presentation, such as more questions on spectatorship and witnessing and the torture on television, for instance, etc. But yeah, I would leave it here. I hope I made the some of my research questions hopefully became clear through this.
Thank you very much, Berenike, for that outline. There's a question already. I'm going to hold that to the end, but I'm now going to ask Victor if he would step in, so perhaps share his screen and give his contribution to today. And just while he's doing that, again, welcome Vania, and apologize for not having seen that you joined us, but it's brilliant. We have our full panel, and I'll come to Vania third. So Victor, thank you very much.
So I feel really, really honored to be able to join the panel and to celebrate Berenike's book. Berenike and I are in a reading group, and so the idea is that each week we kind of join together, drink a lot of wine, and read a lot of works in a very pleasurable way. And in some ways, we all agree we have read quite a lot of works. And we all agree that this is actually one of the best books we have read in the reading group. So I feel really, really happy to be able to say a few things from our research. And so Berenike has kindly asked me to reflect on her book in relation to two specific areas. One particular area is one particular area is the current debate on media philosophy, and also how filmmakers and the audiences find ways to acknowledge, engage in, and make sense of political violence beyond the United States and Latin America. And so, and also, both questions are very close to my research, especially how Buddhist philosophy may help us also rethink media ecology, including human beings, and how independent filmmakers in my birthplace, Hong Kong, process and negotiate the political trauma from the police violence and government surveillance after the protests in 2014, as well as from 2019 to 20. Now, in her book, Berenike aptly points out a seemingly paradoxical phenomenon. On the one hand, with digital technology, images of political violence, police brutality, and even torture are captured, disseminated with very little delay, and even ricocheted, manipulated, and appropriated on social and mass media. In this sense, political violence seems to be hyper-visible in our mode of digital existence. On the other hand, these visible images or even tangible prosthetic experiences remind us of more acts of violence that lie outside the frame, take place in the absence of any imaging devices, or are only visible mechanically or digitally between machines of surveillance. It reminds us how these images may be circulated on social media, not for an audience who would generate empathy and compassion for those who suffer, but would rather use them to reinforce their personal beliefs and ego. It also reminds us how the predictable and imminent acts of government and often willful, convenient public forgetting. Now, as Berenike points out, based on Marcelena Gomez-Barrios' argument, hypervisibility may be an alibi for invisibility. when we think about the digital, we often focus on the digital as a technology, or the digital object as a technology, digital as a technicity, or the digital object as a technology. We seldom examine how our mode of becoming or state of being has been reconfigured as a digital existence. For Höyük, digital existence is best understood as an anthropotechnical process of becoming that is constantly rewritten by micro-perceptual and micro-temporal shifts in the relationships between the human body psyche and digital configurations. It does not mean that there is no perceptual conceptual difference between the corporeal and corporeal body psyche and the digital counterparts, but their mutual dependency and boundaries are microperceptually and microtemporally shifting in a molar manner. To complicate matters, Shane Denson also argues that the images that determine and are driven by these configurations are often communicated and discussed between machines. This is because text, pictures, and sounds, once being transduced and translated into digital data, are processed through an algorithm that can reduce the file size. The algorithm is used not only to maximize transmission speed, but also predict possible outcomes. For example, in a live video chat like what we're having now, a user's facial expression is captured and then processed through an algorithm so that several possible expressions in the next temporal instant can be predicted and, as a matter of fact, generated. The digital processor will then only rewrite a slight change of the user's lips or eyes when keeping the rest of the picture unanimated. When the user makes a physical move in the next instant, the algorithm can then confirm the actualized facial expression retrospectively. These possible images, however, are impossible to be seen by human eyes, even though they exist digitally. This is to say that the hyper-visible images of political violence on social media indicates not only those images that remain invisible because they lie outside of the frame or that they take place in the absence of any imaging devices, but also those images that have been algorithmically constructed in the form of digital data, which lie in the database but remain invisible and would be considered mere digital speculations and or even unreal in our conventional reality. Yet they are constantly used by the police and other forces of governmentality to anticipate both the macroscopic development of a social movement and the micro-perceptual and micro-temporal changes on a protest site. These data often enable the police officers on the ground to exercise preemptive measures against the protesters, thus effectively turning the protest site into a video game played with actual human bodies. As Mackenzie Walk argues, if a video game turns an algorithm into a topography, gamers are always able to learn and conquer the algorithm and the topology itself. This can be seen in the way digital existence is configured and negotiated in the 2019 to 2020 protests in Hong Kong. Now, 22 years after the UK has handed over the administrative rights over Hong Kong to the People's Republic of China, the Fugitive Offenders and Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters legislation Amendment Bill 2019 was published on the 29th of March. A large-scale activist-led socio-political movement was then triggered, with some activists calling for the city's independence. The result was a series of police crackdowns and the eventual passing of the Hong Kong National Security Law, or HKNSL, by Beijing's NPCSC, meaning the National People's Congress Standing Committee, on the 30th of June 2020. Now, the 2019 to 2020 protests had no centralized leadership. Instead, local activists disseminated information about scheduled or spontaneous gatherings, informed their cohorts about police locations and activities, warned each other against police surveillance of their digital devices, made decisions about strategies, and arranged escape routes and transportation. Such guerrilla warfare was built upon a network of mutually unknown activists who might have never met each other physically. Yet their interconnectivity, mutual loyalty, and sense of community were founded on their digital existence as signals, images, voices, and text, of course, eventually the physical body. The longevity of their struggle was partly attributable to their ability to turn a digital ecology that had already been configured for the purpose of governmentality into a milieu where microperceptual and microtemporal opportunities could allow them to regain transient, though potentially impactful agency. Now, images of political violence circulated in social media do not always generate compassion and empathy. As Berenike argues, this often goes against the historically well-accepted assumption, in film studies especially, that visibility can raise awareness. Now, as Brian Masumi argues, images and reports of political violence often generate instantaneous debates on social media. But these debates are not based on a topos or a sincere effort to engage in the actual issues. Rather, social media participants often respond to their subjectivized responses to the affect of the event, the overwhelming feeling that such an event must have posed an unmanageable threat to one's personal or communal existence. For Masumi, and also in accordance with Buddhism, affect is neither subjective nor objective, neither not subjective nor not objective. In Buddhism, in fact, what we call affect is best understood as karma, a set of afflictions that drive and are driven by our actions, speeches, and thought formations. Afflictions here means greed, anger and frustration, delusions, anxieties, worries, and so forth. However, karma is also capable of generating a domain in our consciousness called manas, a domain that subjects all our actions, speeches, and thought formations to the preservation of the self and the impression that this self is permanent. Now, if acts of political violence are often framed and interpreted as a direct existential threat to a social media participant's existence, we end up responding to these images, reports, and analysis not as a discourse, but as an affective response to our own fear and anxiety. To placate our fear and anxiety, we either cease to empathize and care, or to consign our fear under corporate or governmental management. We also end up remembering only those acts of violence that seem to pose a more imminent threat to us, and immediately forgetting and discarding those images that appear to be threatless or unpreemptible within our means and power. In other words, political violence may be hyper-visible, but I choose not to see it as long as it does not help my own survival. But how do we combat the fact that these acts of political violence, once being actualized, are immediately rewritten, erased, or forgotten in the name of forgiven? Berenike's book has provided many different examples of how filmmakers and what filmmakers have done and what the cinema can potentially do. In many recent works, by Hong Kong independent filmmakers, for example, they make use of the cinema as a medium to temporalize the microtemporal and perceptualize the microperceptual. In other words, by stretching, prolonging, and making tangible layers of temporality over the course of the image consciousness process of becoming, or the film's process of becoming, as well as the inter-becoming of all the characters and the participants, the audiences, that constitute part of this image consciousness. The film enables the spectators, directors, and the characters a second chance to relive, rethink, and recomprehend their own experiences. The cinematic experience is comparable to what Thich Nhat Hanh and Sheng Yan would call a glass of water filled with soil and debris. The spectators can immerse themselves into the water and become mindful of layers and layers of events, traumas, memories, positive as well as negative affections and sensations circulating around the water. Yet the immersed sentient body is also patiently waiting for these debris to sink into the bottom until the body becomes fully mindful of the water itself and its own dependent origination or dependent existence with the sentient body. The result is neither a hauntology nor a palimpsest of nostalgia and pure reflection. It is also not simply a pure optical and sound situation. Rather, it makes tangible the here and now of the image as the present and as an embodied experience. The present is, of course, an instantiation of memories from the past, but precisely because of this, we often look back to the past and worry about the present. And it is the combination of a reminiscence and anticipation that compel us to act, react, and reflect. It is through a full mindfulness of the present as the present that we begin to understand those longings, anger and frustration, worries and anxieties that enslave us. But the solution is not to abandon them, but to become mindful of them so that we can understand where lies the agency to rewrite the future. In other words, we acknowledge that we are all part of what Masumi would call the politics of affect. We are all driven by our desire, anger, frustration to act and be enacted. But our mindfulness would begin to allow us to see that affect does not need to be always subjectivized. Rather, we can become mindful of political affect in an abstract state, being neither subjective nor objective, neither not subjective nor not objective. That way we can act and react according to our processes of interbecoming and interbeing in our overall media and mediating ecology. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Victor, for a very stimulating, all-encompassing presentation, and one that reminds me of the connections that actually were made between the Chilean protesters of 2019, of course, and the Hong Kong protests at the same time. So the entanglements that Berenike spoke about in terms of the US and Chile and 9/11, all sorts of dates that we can talk about later, there is also an underlying connection with your own work there, which is striking. I'm now going to invite Vania to join us with her presentation. If you have I don't know if you have a slideshow, Vania, that you'd like to share. You just want to talk. Well, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for this invitation. I really enjoy reading the book. It's an amazing book. I think it's going to be a sort of a required reading for any student on the field of Latin American, Chilean film studies or Latin American cultural studies, because it's a great book. And so I'm going to be reading today my presentation, and I'm going to start with this quote. It's not about 30 pesos, it's about 30 years. Was the slogan of the 2019 protests that took place through Chile, not reacting to a race in Santiago's subway fare, but in response to the widespread social inequality persistent in post-Pinochet era. While nationwide demonstrations forced looking back at the effects of the dictatorship regime, 29 people have died, 2,500 have been injured, and more than 400 protesters have suffered eye mutilation. The act of looking, so central to cinema, has been at the center of the so-called estallido social, the social explosion. And in this context, Dr. Jung's book, The Invisibilities of Political Torture, is a major contribution to this debate. Theoretical reflection of Chile's post-dictatorship concurs that the dominant politics of the democratic transition included the intention to publicly deny or ignore the horror, violence, and human rights violation carried out by Augusto Pinochet regime, reducing the discussion of such traumatic topics to the private sphere. Soon after the democracy restoration, the dictatorship's military repression was a topic excluded from the public debate. The goal of the Concertación government was to look ahead, to insert the country within the global economy, legitimizing the market model imposed by the totalitarianism, and to avoid any attempt to reconcile the traumatic past. As Dr. Jung stated in her book, I quote, forged by the political class and enforced by the judiciary and the media, a pact of silence permeated all society, and Chile was diagnosed as suffering from collective amnesia, end of quote. At the turn of the century, and at the turn of the 21st century, Chilean cinema experienced a major renovation, not only at the level of the content, but in terms of production and distribution. So this cinema is interesting because the military era has been scarcely represented during the post-dictatorship. And if addressed, state violence is mostly omitted, suggested, or displaced off screen. I'm going to quote the book again. According to Dr. Jung, I quote, possible reasons range from institutionalized and internalized censorship, the historical experience of mediatic betrayal and collaboration, the discrepancy in economic risk in comparison to documentary, where such topics continue to dominate, lack of infrastructure and state support to perceive lack of audience, end of quote. In the end, the authoritarian past is a subject excluded both at the institutional level during the political transition and in recent Chilean filmmaking. This cinema invisibility reflects the institutional negotiation in addressing the past during the Chilean post-dictatorship, reflecting indeed this democracy of agreements. The reconciliatory tone, as quoting Nelly Richard, that characterized the post-dictatorial period, while also a sort of spectacularization, namely a mass media representation of memory that proliferated after 2003. And I'm just going to give a little more background about the post-dictatorship and the transition. Chilean political transition was described as incomplete, neither fully consensual nor public, as the Concertación government focused on whitewashing the past. The silence pact, or consensus conspiracy, repressing a memory box, became then institutionalized practices of oblivion concerning traumatic history. Nelly Richard characterizes the post-dictatorship at a time in which there prevailed a consensual mode of democracy of agreements, formulated by the Chilean government of the transition, that marked the passage from political of antagonism to a politics of transaction, end of quote. These politics of transactions developed into a number of negotiation of traumatic memories reflected in contemporary historical cinema, which made the military regime into a critical topic for the reclaimed democracy and the intended national reconciliation. Except for a limited symbolic act of memory restitution, Dr. Jung has mentioned them, the National Commission for Human Rights Violation, the Valek report, and the Museum of Memory and Human Rights, Chile's violent authoritarian repression of its own citizens is a collective experience barely addressed by the post-dictatorship governments. Hence, the neoliberal social and economic system that predominates in Chile is considered a legacy of the authoritarian regime, such as the democratic post-Pinochet governments have been perceived as a continuation of the military regime. And so coming back to the 2019 demonstration, for this reason, it is under scrutiny with the estallido social, not only the historical period of dictatorship, but the 30 years of governments perceived to be a continuation of the totalitarianism, both in terms of the economy and of the regime's impunity. Then the limited interest in history displaying contemporary narrative film production can be seen as the result of this democracy of agreement, revealing more a motivated post-dictatorial politics of detachment rather than a random and unmotivated political detachment. Still, and this is the interesting aspect of this, around 2004, which is the time frame Dr. Jung is studying in her book, there is a shift in public opinion about the military regime, which coincided with a social and cultural boom that included a new mass media envisioning of the past. Indeed, in 2003, Chile was commemorating the 30 years since the coup. And a combination of political and cultural issues promoted an interest in looking back. As Jacqueline Muesca explains, the Unidad Popular period stopped being demonized, and the image of President Allende emerged with all its historical dignity. And institutionalized reconciliation then with the past brought an updated discourse regarding the official history. In cinematographic terms, the Concertación governments performed two emblematic acts endorsing an hegemonic view of the military government. President Ricardo Lagos attended Machuca avant-premiere, symbolizing a state reconciliation with the repressed past in 2004. The film was later Chile's official submission to the 77 Academy Oscar Awards for the best foreign language film. It used to call them at that time best foreign language film. A second expression that provided an institutionalized view of the history was subject to controversy when Miguel Litín movie Dawson Isla 10, a story of the imprisonment of Presidente Allende former cabinet members on a southern island, was selected by the government as Chile's official submissions to the Oscar Awards in 2009. The critics and the public's favorite that year was the dark comedy La Nana by the young director Sebastián Silva. And the imposition of Litín's movie as a candidate for an Oscar became an emblem of the official envisioning of the past. But also at the same time, and I think that is so amazing, the corpus selected in the book, because it's very interesting years for film and media production. By 2003, mass media began playing a new role in the production of historical imaginary, becoming stakeholders in the elaboration of a collective memory excluded from the public debate until that time. At the turn of the decade and into 2010s, television programs such as Los 80 and Los Archivos del Cardenal, studied in the book, were extremely popular. Both broadcast fictionalized for the first time on local TV historical events, discussion of which had been displaced to the private domain, not only by the dictatorship, but again, by the democratic successors, producing what Dr. Jung calls in the book an atomization and privatization of pain, end of quote. The small screen began to reflect this traumatic memory, bringing up an aesthetic dominated by the society of spectacle and minimizing the contradictions of memory that were in dispute. And I'm quoting Elizabeth Jellin here. While simultaneously open up such imagery for those Chileans born after the return of democracy. The invisibilities of political torture is a notable contribution to this field. By combining film theory and visual analysis, the book offers a political film critique that goes beyond representation and identification-centered approaches. Basically, as Dr. Jung says, the film discussed here access the real, not impure or direct. Instead of a transparent phenomenal world revealed in cinema, this film pointed precisely to what is hidden, disappearing, or inaccessible about the past. They highlight the intrusive organization of a narrative agency, the mediation of history, the skepticism toward visual evidence. Accordingly, the book provides a complex interpretation connecting disappearance, central modes of vision, and conveying the presence of absence in contemporary Chilean cinema. Field corpus, the seek to counter revisionist narrative to bring historical disappearances into the present time of viewing, making structural invisibilities visible. The Chilean dictatorship used practices of making disappear that to some extent continue up to this day via the economic and the structural violence of extremely uneven distribution resources. In particular, the question of the digital turn already mentioned by Victor Fan, the cinema and reality opens an innovative study of violence, memory, and history in current media. Furthermore, Dr. Jung articulates a captivating analysis examining central modes of seeing, revisiting models of film identification, and concept of subjectivity to reframe then forms of vision. Ultimately, the invisibilities of political torture offers an intriguing treatment of the affective dimension of the cinematic experience to address the unspeakable, reassess the archive, and to expand our parameters of seeing and thereby connecting to the past. Finally, both scholarship and Chilean cinema in the post-dictatorship is still seeking a language to represent the horror and the traumas of the past, and is still searching to restore the Chilean memory. Given that police repression of the estallido social protest resulted in many people partially or totally blinded due to the police aiming rubber bullets and tear gas canister at protester eyes, being able to witness and denounce abuses in Chile and from abroad via social media has taken an increased importance. And the invisibility of political torture expands the theoretical discussion on seeing, appraising, remembering, and feeling the terror of violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vania, for a really clear outline of the Chilean context, bringing us right up to date as well, and giving us that wonderful appreciation of Berenike's book along the way. What we'd like to do now for 10 or 15 minutes is with our three presenters to get their thoughts on the exchanges and presentations they've made. While we're doing that, I'll again invite you, if you want to make comments or questions in the chat, I'll do my best then to put them to our speakers and to collate them as there may be overlaps. But if I can start, Berenike, with you, because this is your book, and this is in many ways a celebration of your work and achievement. And when I was reading the introduction, and I'll just start with this, you talk about a shared feeling between growing up in West Berlin and going to Chile. And we've talked about Hong Kong, and your book brings in the US. So one of the questions I had is not just why talk about this now, but what does it feel like to talk about this now? I mean, you started the research some time ago. The world has changed, as Victor has showed us in his presentation. So looking back now on the project, what does it feel like to talk about this now? And does it feel different talking to perhaps a Chilean audience or a US audience or an international audience?
Yeah, thank you, Alison. No, that's a great question. I think the funny thing is that in some things have changed a lot, and I noted that also when Victor was talking, that I was with the Abu Ghraib images, for instance, that these were not yet on social media. They were digital, but it was still like digital cameras. Like it was just on the cusp of these very massive changes that have since only become even more complicated. But I feel like there's still in this idea of what is the role of images, and like how much do we trust images, how do we use them, etc. So there was already a bit happening at that time. And in some ways, I would, for that reason, and because there's so many exciting things happening in Chile, as Vania also pointed out, so certain things I would now write differently. I would also talk about, the kind of, this new body that is writing a new constitution, etc. So some things look a bit more hopeful, perhaps, with the protest. But other things remain, I still feel very similar about some of them, and that includes very much also this this point that you made about there are these many different areas that I'm trying to combine. So both film studies and how they talk about visuality and how that is conceptualized, and then different area studies and the kind of scholarship that comes from there, and the kind of typical paradigms that are used there. And that is both a challenge and an opportunity that also has to do with me as a person who's not Chilean, who's not American, but who and looks at these things in comparison. How do I frame that comparison? How do I combine these different disciplines without, with sensibility, but also without overstepping too much, or acknowledging my own position, I guess. So yeah, that is, and with Victor's examples of Hong Kong, again, I feel it's become, even, if anything, through social media, it's become even more transnational, even more like a transnationally project, or something that I always felt like this affects us all, or it should affect us all. I mean, I know not to pose any kind of universal universal humanism, but I think we are related, and even we are linked to one another, either on a very in Butler's terms of grievability, or with Victor's Buddhist approach. I think that is my fundamental conception, and we are also interlinked, just on political terms, as a globally more and more interconnected community, etc. So yeah, that is how I feel about this today.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to ask actually Victor and Vania if they'd like to come in on that, because one of the questions that come up in the chat already is coming out, I think, of Chilean specificity. And actually one of my questions was this question of universality versus specific context. And so I'm just wondering, from the three of you, but perhaps Victor and Vania might like to respond to what you've just said, how you manage this question of our shared worlds, yet understanding that the films you're working with are coming out of a specific context, which might be that the director is, the son of a Pinochet minister in the case of Larraín that was mentioned, or that these might have a particular audience. So can you address how you negotiate that balance? Because it seems to be crucial that we do negotiate it, but that we can't give up. So do you have thoughts on that? Victor, would you like to come in?
Sure. The idea is that I think the idea is that there are certain things that obviously we can have cross-cultural conversations. So the idea is that I often find that because when for example, in the study of Asian cinema media, a lot of people in the past 15, 20 years, we have been very, very heavily engaged in an idea called Asia's method. And so there are two camps of scholars trying to address this question of specificity versus some people call it universality, but if we don't like the term, we can call it transnational translatability, portability, a lot of these things. But the idea is that what I find is that there is a camp of scholars who would think that, well, Asian, first of all, for example, when we are thinking about, can there be anything called Asian theory? So a camp of scholars would say, no, I mean, you can't even talk about that because theory by definition is a colonial construction. And so, the idea is that if we talk about critical debates in Asia, for example, this particular group of scholars would say that, no, we're precisely not trying to do what Euro-American scholars have been doing over a whole century by suggesting that these theories are automatically universal. But what we call universal sometimes can be an imposition. The idea is that if we say that, oh yeah, we can always use Foucault's biopolitics on everything without really thinking about that particular concept really originally had a particular value and a particular meaning within France or within the kind of Francophone understanding of colonialism. but the other camp of scholars, I would say that sometimes, but if we really say that, okay, we can only focus on specificities and we can only really care about this level of specificity, then sometimes we seem to be burning the bridge before we build it. So the idea is that, well, then the presumption, I mean, sometimes in the 1980s, some Chinese language scholars, for example, would say that, oh yeah, like Euro-American scholarship is specific and Chinese scholarship is specific because so we tend to fall into the trap that Asians exceptionalism or Chinese exceptionalism or Japanese exceptionalism, it becomes another kind of post-colonial construction. So in my forthcoming book, for example, I'm thinking about the idea of mindfulness. The idea is that we are not trying to say that, well, we're putting them into comparative dialogue. It doesn't mean that they're the same. And it doesn't mean that they're automatically communicatable. We need to be mindful that we have theoretical translations with linguistic translations, with cultural translations. And when we are talking about comparison, we really need to think about the idea is not just about similarities and differences, but the idea of what kind of critical and cultural productions are generated and also negotiated as a result precisely of these differences. And I do find that on a more practical level, some of the more translatable, or if we use a more convenient word, that's a lot of people may disagree with, the idea of quote unquote universality. And some of the things that we can kind of a little bit more easily translate would be, for example, certain issues about technicity, certain ways in which, frankly, when human beings interact with the machine, when we interact with technology, the technicity part, the anthropotechnical part, sometimes there are many things that we share. And I'm not saying that it's naturally so. It's also part of a historical condition because many modes of digital existence are quite, you can say, global or multi or kind of interregional and intra-regional. But then obviously there are very, very specific sociopolitical values and cultural specificities that we need to take care of. And simply because I think last week we were discussing, a group of scholars in Singapore and I were discussing the ideas that, yes, we have these documentaries. And then when I talk about these documentaries are trying to put us in a mindfulness state, but we still need to take into account that some of the documentaries were being shown, for example, here in London or elsewhere in Rotterdam or any other places. And we do hear some audiences not being able to relate to it because they have no historical knowledge of a particular sensibility. And so those specificities definitely need to be taken into account and can be a headache for filmmakers. Because how do filmmakers communicate and negotiate certain affects that we sometimes tend to think that I think my audience, my international audiences can empathize. It seems to be such a human value or universal value. I'm using these romantic terms, but then somehow they are not. Because they have the specificities. And so they're really concrete issues. Yeah.
Thank you. Vania, given that you do quite a lot of work on gender studies as well as Chilean cinema, you might have a slightly different take on this because, of course, gender studies brings in the same issues. I was wondering what your thoughts were on coming out of Chilean film, but, seeing the connections that very often get made in terms of the Chilean experience of dictatorship, post-dictatorship and memory, the experiences of social questions that you raised and inequalities which extend beyond Chile. What are your thoughts on this question of managing the boundary between the case or example or the country and the wider shared concerns?
Well, what I feel is that there are two issues or two objects to discuss here. One is the events of the demonstrations, as in the case of Chile, because I wanted to focus that that's something that really can frame or reframe all these cultural production from the last 2 decades in Chile. And the other aspect is the cultural production in itself, namely the cinema. So if we are thinking about the events, about the demonstrations in 2019, I would say that these demonstrations in 2019, which ended up with the drafting of the new constitution. Right now we have the Constituent Assembly drafting this new constitution. It's not casual. This was kind of very evident around 2010 when we had all this movement, the Wall Street movement. We had all the movement in Spain around 2010, 2012. What was the name of the Wall Street movement? Or in Spain?
And the Indignados.
There's Indignados, yeah. So I have the feeling that the last decade, from 2010 around 2021, we have a growing rejection and discussion about neoliberalism, because ultimately what's happening in Chile, what we are seeing in Chile in terms of the demonstration, is not as much the problem of the dictatorship, but the problem is neoliberalism, and neoliberalism that the democratic governments didn't revert or try to solve at some point. So if we are thinking about the event, ultimately neoliberalism connects, I would say, the entire globe at some point. So we are in a certain manner all connected, and we can see that this was born, I would say, at least 10 years ago. And I'm pretty sure that it's going to keep going on, because neoliberalism is a collective global problem. And in terms of visual production, I'm thinking about the films we are discussing today. It's part of the debate, the fact how Chilean cinema, the global South, is negotiating their own visual images to enter into the international circuit of film festival and to the international audiences. So that's also another issue, how Chile is presenting certain images or certain topics that are more, I would say, popular, or kind of the burden of this representation that Chileans have in their filmmaking to be accepted or to enter into the international circuit. So those are two issues that we can discuss further and further. But if you ask me, how do I see the problem? They are connected basically with neoliberalism and how Chilean filmmaking create a certain image about what is Chile. But I really would like that if the audience has any other comments or thought about this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to invite the audience to speak. Perhaps if you want to raise your hand and keep your comment short so that everyone has a chance. But in the meantime, Berenike, do you want to comment? Please do.
No, sorry, I just wanted, because while I completely agree with what Vania was saying, that, and I think it's partly also what I would have replied to some of the points that were raised in the chat, is that it's quite difficult still to make. I mean, it's relatively difficult in general to make films, and to find distribution and exhibition means of doing that. But in Chile, it's more difficult than, for instance, it would be in Germany. And so there is scholarship on how many filmmakers need to make a choice between, am I going to make this film but I only have money for documentary? Or am I going to make this film but I won't find distribution exhibition unless I somehow cater to this, I need to find a festival that accepts it. The festivals have a certain predilection for certain types of films, etc. But one of my arguments in the book was also that it seems from my research, from talking to people, from talking to filmmakers, etc., that many of these films also chose to have a double audience, that there are certain things that are clearly aimed perhaps at a more international audience, but there are other things that that are, only understood perhaps to people who are more knowledgeable about the events and about the country, etc., which perhaps in a way points to what Victor said about these things sort of being almost a dialogue. And I also wanted to mention that I liked, I know the discourse on no, I know that it's seen as problematic by many people. It's interesting how there are like two somewhat more dominant approaches in Western media and in Chilean media. But if you look at, and I discuss it, and I think it can be discussed, and but if you look at the film itself and not at the authorial figure, there is quite a high degree of self-reflexivity in the films, and the films really look at what can the visual hide, what can visual media, how can film say anything about the past, about memories, etc. And so they're very interesting to discuss on that level. That's something. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to mention about what Vania said, that yes, another way of framing why this in a way is still a topic is, I think it was Thomas Muljan who said that the torture helped to install the neoliberal system, and Chile was the petri dish for neoliberalism, with the Chicago boys coming there, and now we all suffer from it in a way. I mean, so there's a different way of bringing this into the present as well, as not like something that is long past and like an issue of a particular country, and it's a long time ago and doesn't affect anybody else.
Yeah, thank you, Berenike. I was just going to say before I bring Erwin in for his question that actually, Vania, when you were talking about Spain, and I've done a lot of work on memory in Spain, and the question of the nature of the economic system that was set up in the transition is precisely like Chile, what is now in question over the last decade. So you're quite right that this is underpinning a lot of questions. But Erwin, would you like to put your point or question or comment as it is?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Berenike, I want to congratulate you, first of all, for this book and putting together this great event also. So like both like really intriguing and great achievements. And we are former colleagues from Tübingen, so that's our connection here. Since you mentioned self-reflexivity, I have a two-part question. First of all, are you aware of films, moving images being used as tools of torture? Maybe Flickr films, but maybe other films as well. Similar to how loud music is used in several countries as well as a tool of torture. And in connection to that, I mean, there are several films that show films being used as a tool of torture or a tool of torturous indoctrination, and most notably probably A Clockwork Orange. So how would you conceptualize this in your ontological epistemological approach to movies and torture?
Yeah, thanks, Erwin, and thank you for being here. Also to Lucas and everybody else that I know. So I didn't look at films as tools of torture because to my knowledge, that was not an issue in the particular cases that I looked at. I looked for some time at the music aspect, the loud music aspect for Abu Ghraib, but in the end, I moved a bit away from this, from the exploration of all the individual specific methods, etc. And so I sort of bracketed that, I guess. The second, your second part was, remind me again, what was the second part of the question?
Like when movies are showing like meta-referentially, like movies as a means of torture and like this, I don't know, strapped in situation in the cinema.
No, absolutely. So I think that was part of where I started and where I thought, okay, this is sort of the standard criticism not only of violence in the movies, but also what is the expectations that we bring? What do we expect from the visual image or from movies? What do we expect to them to achieve? And so that is a bit in the context of media effects. And again, it's still this idea of like, okay, if you show the correct image, then people will have the correct affective response or emotional response. We show a wrong image, showing violence creates violent acts, etc. So, I mean, this is very obviously a very condensed and simplified version of this, but I really followed the Rancière's criticism of the pedagogical model of art of this, that we ask the wrong thing of the visual image to do. So a film like Clockwork Orange, I think it's a great, it does a lot of super interesting philosophical things, but I don't think it's like, it's not the truth or like a realistic, like how I think, or how films work, or perhaps also how media in general doesn't work. And so I think I started by saying, okay, this is like a concept of spectatorship and a concept of cinema that I'm not following. And I'm also not really following this distrust of the emotion versus the intellectual approach, that the intellectual one is always the better one, and films as other media that affect us emotionally strongly are therefore sort of suspicious, and it's a sort of elitist distrust of that as well. Thanks.
Thanks. Carol would like to ask a question, if I can bring her in now. And just to say, if you're trying to raise your hand, it's in the little reactions icon at the bottom, or just send me a message and I'll know that you want to ask something. Carol.
Hello, I'd just like to thank you all for putting on this really interesting talk, and for the author of the book. I think the book is relevant. Picking up on what Vania said, I mean, torture is still a tool used in Chile. There's this conflict between this modernity and then this kind of overhang of the dictatorship. The dictatorship won't leave until the constitution is voted in. And let's not be fooled. I mean, this is a process. It's a process. It's not happening yet. There's very strong propaganda against the new constitution being written. And this is what I wanted to pick up on in terms of Pablo Larraín being a producer and being a producer of what was a very important part of Chilean history. For us, it's very troubling that the son of a Pinochet minister, in fact, we're not talking about, his father's Hernán Larraín, and it matters. How do you separate the person from the cultural production they're engaging in? Hernán Larraín is a problem, the father of Pablo Larraín, because he's still in the government. I mean, we're not talking about past events, we're talking about these actors are still entrenched in Chilean politics, and there's still a sort of cloud of fear in Chile. For me, it's problematic that the son of a Pinochet minister makes his films. One, because he's part of a cultural elite that has infinite access to resources. Therefore, his voice will then opaque the voice of other people who may have similarly interesting projects, but do not get the funding in Chile because of their political affiliations and their point of view. For us, no. I mean, speaking as a Chilean, the daughter of Chilean refugees, the granddaughter of a torture victim, for us, the film Low was actually quite disturbing. It felt like a whitewashing and a propaganda tool that has then been sort of replicated over and over again by academics and cultural producers around the world. So, I mean, I do think that there needs to be a little bit of care as to, I think it's important that those who are looking at these films understand where these films are coming from, who is financing those voices, and who these labels and these voices and these projections of history serve. Remember that there's still a blanket of silence in Chile. There's still the military pact of silence because, until the constitution is changed, all those dictatorship laws are still in place, right? And I wanted to ask the author, because we still have these actors controlling Chilean politics, and they won't be removed until there's a sea change and the loss of fear that will come when there is a proper reconstruction of Chilean society and the military are removed of their privileges. How does the author feel that this book will be received in Chile? And what will be like the social impact of this book, this very important book, I may add? What does she think will be the political, socio-political repercussions of this book and reactions in Chile to this book? Thank you very much.
Thank you for these very challenging questions. But yeah, thank you. I think it's important. Okay, I made some notes. I hope I'll cover everything. So to me, it seemed like part of the reason why there is still, you're very right to point out that we still have these very entrenched battles of memory in Chile. They are, as you rightly pointed out, there's still like certain terrorist laws that can very easily be used, etc. Like there are all kinds of mechanisms that are still in place, which, by the way, is not that different from the US, where the torture decree was, there was an executive decree that outlawed torture, but whichever president comes next can like just take them off the shelf again and use them again. So it's not, it's very transient, the kind of protection that is gained. I found that in my research, I had the impression that part of the problem is that there are very few films, actually very few fiction films in Chile that explore this. There are a lot of documentaries, they're great documentaries, there are very few fiction films. So there seems to be an inordinate amount of pressure and importance that is put to the Larraín dictatorship trilogy, because it's one of the few films and they were relatively successful also internationally. And so, yes, as you said, they took a lot of space, relatively speaking. So I think that's the key problem. There should be many more films and there should be a diversity of that. In terms of the film itself, I think it shows very strongly that I know that there are different, obviously it can be discussed in different ways. My analysis showed that there is actually quite strong pointing of this film of how the past is still very much present. And that is both done on this material level, as well as, with like smaller images on like the train that goes in circles, etc. So there is very much more like something that I would have interpreted in a more critical mode, that in fact these things are not just in the past and irrelevant in some ways. I personally did not follow this. I think, Larraín certainly has privilege through his inheritance. As far as I have found out, I have not seen him. I know he's the son of a right-wing minister. I think he is not personally politically involved. And now there is this vexed question: how much is the person, the author, the director, present in the film? So there are different ways where there are like methodological choices to make. And so I did not take, it's not on me to finally decide these things. So I sort of discussed them. In terms of the last thing about how this book will be received in Chile, I am curious to find out. I don't think that, this is an academic book. I'm not sure how much I'm not under any delusion how much difference that can make, but I hope it might contribute to a discussion. That is my answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Berenike. I don't see any other hands up or people wishing to ask a question. So I'm going to take the liberty I'll bring in Ivan in just a second and Jimena, but you've actually mentioned the audience question. So perhaps we might bring that in, the question of the audience. And I was going to ask actually about the US and how much difference discussions of this might make there. But perhaps we could wrap that into Ivan's question and Jimena's question as well. So Ivan, would you like to go ahead? I think you had your hand up first.
Hi, yes. Just a quick question. I'm curious if Nika could elaborate on how her findings and research on political torture informs a more recent projects, such as the work on visual social media, such as TikTok. There is clearly an important epistemological train there, and body and how it is represented. And so I was just curious if she could. Thank you.
Would you like to address that briefly, Berenike?
Yeah, I mean, I think. Okay, now I have the there is it's true, as you said right at the beginning. These topics might perhaps seem very, very distinct, but in some ways following this line of the role of the body in images, the role of our affective relation to images, how we use images, how we connect through images or disconnect what perhaps is hidden in images. That there are several through lines for me there, relating even to something like that TikTok. When I started working on TikTok, nobody really knew what it was. And it was because it was initially only used by preteens, and it was this very again like a media format that seemed to be looked at a bit disdainfully by like a broader it didn't catch the limelight in some ways, and then I'm sorry. So this is basically the through line between these bodies of work.
Jimena, would you like to come in?
Yeah. Hello. Together with thanks for your work, because I think it is very interesting. I want to add kind of reflection on the social construction of the concept of torture in Chile, because there was no law, there was no definition of torture in Chilean law before 2016. In November 2016, it was passed the current law of torture, and before that, it was only a concept raised by human rights organizations, social movements, lawyers and psychologists used that word, but it wasn't a word included in Chilean law, okay? So it wasn't possible, for example, to pursue a demand, to raise a claim on torture. You had to use an euphemism, another kind of expression to talk about it, because it wasn't, Chilean lawyers and Chilean justice structure is tied to letter. So if it wasn't included in the code, you couldn't talk about torture before that. So this is very important, I think, because together with the social movements and the professionals that worked with tortured people or promoting the rights of tortured people, started a cultural movement, mainly led by theater and literature. You can see more works representing, somehow working with the idea of torture with different elements and more connected, tightly connected to social movements in theater and in literature. That they have a different space to talk about it and to reach a more intimate connection with the audience. It was very hard to include this topic in TV or in cinema, as Berenike work shows. And precisely in the 30 years of the coup d'etat, the moment that she chose in her book is a moment where we were shocked of watching these scenes that we have seen. People like me, I am a historian and I am a human rights activist in Chile. So we have seen these scenes in private spaces with groups of people. For example, in the 2000s, I was involved in a group who had all the recordings of documentaries or movies talking about human rights in VHS. And we visited different places with small groups to watch the movie and talk about it, because it wasn't shown on the cinemas or on TV. And so that moment was very important. And I think that since then, up until now, there are new windows opening. For example, sexual political violence. That is something that feminist collective groups working with human rights have promoted during the last, specifically since 1999, with a documentary called La Venda, The Bandage. That was the first one that talked about women and sexual political violence or sexual torture. Since then, up until now, there have been a lot of movement in this specific element of torture, and it has been worked in theater and now also in movies like La Bestia, the one that is being considered for the Oscars this year, an animation without words, but where you have this story that is focused in Venda Sexy, and it takes a space. The same year, this was news in the newspaper like 2 weeks ago, the same year that the judicial system in Chile is acknowledging sexual torture, is because there have been a couple of cases where the judges have decided to take it into consideration. Yeah, and that is for the first time in all these years. So I think, to end, if somebody is interested in gender issues and torture and kind of things, that is the kind of topic that I have written and worked about for a long time. But I just want to highlight that next year are the 50 years after the coup d'etat. So we can expect, based on the importance that what they call the reenactment, if I'm not wrong, that the images of violence produced by the revolt in 2019 and 2020, the importance that, for example, sexual torture and sexual political violence had in the revolt, and this change in concepts, but also the space or the impact that is producing, for example, Bestia right now, that is very interesting, at least for me. I think that we can expect for the next year other kinds of, another book you can write about it, Berenike, because you will see that the concept of torture is being, in this social construction, is getting another depth and density. So I think that you can even open these new paths that were not considered before, like gender issues.
No, thank you, Jimena, well, for explaining and also for mentioning this film, which I'll definitely look at. But I think definitely these are very important aspects to consider. And in fact, I talked a little bit about some of the similarities between sexual violence and rape and torture, that just on a level of like the spectacle, when it's shown, when it's represented, being something sort of that is abject on the one hand and on the other. So it raises all kinds of questions again and about spectatorship and ethics, etc. I just wanted to also to add on what you said, that both so Chile ratified the UN Convention Against Torture in 1988, and the US did that in 1994. But of course, that didn't stop, either country from continuing or doing whatever they were doing, because you can always like redefine then these kind of these what you consider falling under the treaty. And so something like even considering sexual violence, for instance, it's very important to think about that as well.
Thanks. I think Catalina would like to come in. Go ahead. Nice to see you.
Just regarding the torture and in the context, the violation or sexual abuse within the torture. I think there was a group of, we were 4 Chilean who were in Argentina. We took within the Operación Condor, and we did a demand on sexual torture, and was the first time that there was that kind of demand, and I think in Argentina also after that, and they got they win the case. Yeah, in our case, as we were following this demand in Chile by the Barraza judge, and there was closed the investigation because there was no more element to contribute towards the investigation. But I think it's this was a big discussion about how to consider torture within the consider violation or sexual abuse within the torture process. And I think there's a very good book about how this happened with this Argentinian. It's called Guerrilleras y Putas, yeah, in which you can see, and it happened here in Chile, where the tortured and the military took as this prisoner as lovers and going out with them, and all this kind of submission, and I think it's and I think this what I think is about this the book. I haven't read the book, and I heard all the comment. It's true what Berenike said, that it's very academic, and we were also used to more the testimonial books, and I think it's quite interesting that you grasp from those testimonies and from all these all those situations, the concept, the intellectual discussion about that, and I think it contributes towards more knowledge about what's going on in those. Because for us it's very difficult to understand why people, or what some of those men or women behave like that. They torture, it's very, very difficult to explain for oneself. And then I remember when I said to them, why are you doing that? And they said, it's the same you do to us. And I think it's I was blindfolded. I was with my hand, no possible to defend myself. And then the thing is that it's very interesting why, for example, in the Berenike here, they were trying to get information and the truth, their truth. But the thing is, which information from whom? For who? Because it's I don't think they are conscious, those who make the torture, conscious about they are within a kind of a whole structure and a whole how can I put it, about what they're into, you know, but they're used in order to, because they share those feeling about anti-communist, terrorism, etc., who are they feed in all the process of formation, you know, and because the human rights today is transversal to all the training for police and human rights. I don't know how this work in practice, but at least it's something that they have set up. And I don't know, I was going to say something else, but I forgot. Sorry. But I would like to thank you for your work, and I think it's very interesting and very good, and it's amazing that you still keep memory, you know, and from very long way, far, the time also has passed long, but it still is. How do you say penando? Carol must know the word penando.
Haunting.
Haunting. Yes, haunting. Yes.
Hola, Catalina.
Hola, hola, Carola. La conocí chiquitita, guagua en realidad. En la guata de la Carola. En la guata de la Carola. Nice to see you here. Well, that's a thank you.
Thanks, Catalina. We're close to the end of our time, so what I'm going to do, first of all, I'm going to thank you and everybody else for your comments, but I know that both Vania and Victor have their hands up, so what I'm going to do is ask them, they'll make their comments, and then, as I say, since this is to celebrate Berenike's book, I'm going to ask her if she would like to close. So, Vania, would you like to come in with your thoughts as we bring this wonderful discussion towards its end?
Yes. Well, very briefly, what I want to mention, and I appreciate Carolina and Catalina comment, is that if we are talking today about this, is that the past is still present. And when I feel like what Berenike is trying to work in this book and what we are trying to discuss, to think about is the fact that we need to think about the present. How do we deal with this present? How we deal with this past today? And so based on that, I understand, when I watch No, I understand the frustration that the movie No created in some audiences. And I totally agree that the Larraín, he's a privileged one. But also we cannot really judge an author because this person is the son of someone. And I feel like we need to also consider that. When I watch No, and the very first line of the movie says, what you are going to see is about the future or the present. And the last sentence of the movie is exactly the same because the main character, Saavedra, is presenting this spot. And so based on that first line of the movie, I perceive the movie not talking about the past, not talking about No. But when I watched the movie, I felt that the movie was intended to talk about today. Is to talk about today. And based on that, I think that's why it's so relevant. It's so relevant to think that the past is not something that it happened, that is past, that is close back in our back. Is kind of something that we are living every day. Catalina lives every day with her past. So Carolina también. So I feel like this movie helps us to understand today, not as much the past, but I think that this movie, we need to understand them as helping us to see what is happening, what is happening today. And for me, for example, Carne de Perro is one of the greatest movies. It moved me more than No, for example, because I really, there is an entire discussion about the accomplices of dictatorship. And that's something, the debate that is today, that it's kind of around, but it has not been discussed in deep. What happened with the accomplices, what the civil society that was accomplished with this. And I think those are the topics that are still going on today, even if the coup happened almost 50 years ago. And well, I know we have to close. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate this event. And I think that the book, it's going to be a very important book for the future years in the discussion of Chilean and Latin American filmmaking.
Thanks, Vania. Victor?
Yeah, I also want to say that this particular conversation about gender, sexual harassment, and also very gender-specific sexual harassment as a means of torture, I do want to say that, first of all, in the case of the 2014 protests and also the 2019-20 protests in Hong Kong, one really horrific thing that a lot of people could observe right away was that the police had a very specific agenda to use sexual harassment as a means to divide the women, usually very young women who in the crowd, and actually use them. And the policy had a name by the police themselves, is to turn a woman's body into a weapon against themselves. And so, and it's a horrific thing. And the other thing, I also, the idea is that one thing that this particular conversation has inspired me to keep thinking is that our way of memorizing, our way of making films, sometimes making films, producing literature, to memorize traumas, memorize violence. A lot of times we tend to forget that our means of archiving and writing and memorizing sometimes can be very gender biased. And in some ways they are still kind of ongoing. Because let's say even when we are watching a documentary, let's say in the case of Hong Kong again, when we are watching a documentary, sometimes made by heterosexual men, for example, cisgender heterosexual men, sometimes we get the idea of this is really universalizing the experience of all the participants, all the protesters, to the extent that we get an impression that, oh, everyone is a hero. So this becomes almost like the flip side of the coin of the kind of nationalist narrative. The idea is that, oh, everyone is a hero, everyone sheds blood, without acknowledging the fact that, I mean, one thing that inspired me a lot was Gina McCarthy from the University of Hong Kong has introduced me to a lot of documentaries and fiction films made by women. And this year in the International Film Festival Rotterdam also features specifically films about the aftermath of the protest. And the idea is that we do need to kind of, I think when we are discussing these issues, I think all of you have inspired me, and also I'm sure like everyone in this chat room, the idea is that how do we actually become constantly mindful of the genderedness of these experiences, and also the idea of like how, and in some ways one film by Clara Law this year about the idea that she is carrying what Vania has just said. The idea is that she's carrying the trace of trauma, which is etched onto the body of a woman. And that is not just carrying the past, because she's living the past as the present. And so I think a lot of these issues, I think it's so important to remember and also be mindful of. And Gina also points out a very important thing is that in the aftermath, I think we also tend to forget that many members, in the case of Hong Kong, many members of the LGBTQI+ communities were the first to get caught, first to get arrested, questioned, and again, based on the idea of their sexuality in relationship to their suspected, quote unquote, political positions. And so I think all of these complexities do need to be addressed. And like Vania, I just feel so honored and and really happy to be able to be part of this. And Berenike, you have really, I think, talking about, again, not universality, but the idea of like comparativity and translatability. And I think the idea is that you have really provided a vocabulary for so many of us globally to think about this issue. Yeah.
Wow, Victor, you said that so beautifully. The value of this book is enormous. And Berenike, we've had a wonderful conversation, but I would really like to give you the final few minutes. I hope the platform won't turn into a pumpkin and we all puff away. So please, would you like to give some final reflections?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's me who feels really blessed and honored at such a great, I mean, so many people coming, engaging with this work, with these topics, with my thoughts on it. I feel that is, I feel very grateful for that. It's really, that was wonderful. And I'm particularly happy that you also all raised so many aspects that I couldn't really all cram into my small presentation at the beginning, such as, how movies, obviously at the time, movies about the past speak perhaps about the past, but they always also speak to the presence of their making. And so there is also that always to consider when we discuss them. And I want to thank Carolina for, I think you all really for being so frank and raising all these different aspects. I just had one final thing perhaps to say with regards to the limits of this work, which are generally the limits of representations of things, and that leads back to thoughts on to what extent can we even communicate limit events? Can we communicate about pain, about very strong experiences? So there are limits, right? So that is, nobody disputes that, but it's really fascinating to see that there are so many wonderful works have come out and coming out now that discuss, that put, as Victor said, raise a kind of dialogue as well among different audiences, different countries, different experiences, etc. So I don't know. I'm just really, I mean, this is a horrible topic, but I'm very, very grateful that you came and that you engaged with this. So thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, can we all just, even in the conventional fashion, if you can't find the hand clapping, give Berenike a wonderful round of applause.
Thank you.
I also want to thank Victor and Vania for really contributing to this discussion. To all those who put comments in the chat, who've made their comments, to say, I was asked, the book is published by Edinburgh University Press, so if you have a university library, please ask them to buy it. But Berenike, it remains for me to congratulate you.
Thank you.
To wish you well with the next projects that have been hinted at in some of the questions, and that you yourself are doing, and to thank you for what has probably been a long number of years of work, but which is really, really a guide for anyone who's working on the questions of film and representation, on the question of torture specifically, on memory in Chile, and indeed, we haven't mentioned much, but the US as well, where of course the questions of images and representation of validity, truth and fake truth and so on are resonating in my head. But for now, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us. Do stay safe in the current context and have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Alison.